in the heart of Montana's rugged wilderness where ancient traditions collide with modern prejudices. One act of courage would shatter everything the townspeople thought they knew about honor, loyalty, and the true meaning of brotherhood. Jake Morrison was just another ranch hand to the folks of Cedar Falls, a quiet cowboy who kept to himself, worked hard, and minded his own business. But when he witnessed something that would haunt most men's nightmares, Jake didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the consequences, the mockery that would follow, or how his simple act of human decency would be twisted into town gossip and cruel laughter. What the people of Cedar Falls didn't know was that Jake's rescue of a young Native American woman would awaken something far more powerful than their small-minded prejudices could comprehend. They laughed at the cowboy who dared to cross invisible lines, who chose compassion over conformity. They mocked his integrity, dismissed his courage, and thought their cruel words would be the end of the story. They were wrong, because when the sun rose the next morning, the horizon would thunder with the sound of 200 horses carrying warriors whose loyalty ran deeper than blood, whose honor burned brighter than the Montana sun. The same people who had laughed would soon understand that some bonds transcend race, religion, and the petty boundaries that small minds create. This is the story of how one cowboy's courage earned him an army. The October wind cut through Cedar Falls like a blade, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of an early winter. Jake Morrison pulled his hat low against the gusts as he guided his horse along the ridge overlooking Crow Creek. The sun hung low, painting the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson that made even the hardest man pause to appreciate. God's handiwork, Jake wasn't heading anywhere in particulars, riding to clear his head after another long day mending fences on the Harrison Ranch. At 28, he'd spent half his life working other men's land, saving every dollar he could toward buying his own piece of heaven. The other ranch hands called him antisocial, but Jake preferred solitude to their endless complaints about weather, wages, and women. The sound reached him before he saw anything a woman's scream, sharp and desperate, cutting through the evening air like a knife through silence. Jake's horse, Ranger, tensed beneath him, ears pricked forward. Without hesitation, Jake spurred his mount toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through a stand of cottonwoods, he spotted them. 3 men in expensive hunting gear surrounding a young Native American woman beside an overturned ATV. Her long black hair was matted with dirt, her traditional beaded necklace torn, and her dark eyes blazed with fierce defiance even as she backed against a fallen log. "Come on, sweetheart," sneered the largest of the men, someone Jake recognized as Brad Hutchins, son of the bank president. "We just want to be friendly, show you how real Americans have fun." The woman spat something in her native language that needed no translation. Brad's companions laughed ugly sounds that made Jake's skin crawl. He knew these men, wealthy hunters who came to Montana thinking their money bought them the right to do whatever they pleased. Jake didn't announce himself. He simply rode into the clearing, his hand resting casually on the rope coiled at his saddle. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of handling spooked cattle in dangerous situations. Brad spun around, his face flushed with alcohol and anger. Well, if it isn't Jake the Hermit." "This ain't your business, cowboy. Keep riding." "Can't do that," Jake replied, dismounting slowly, deliberately. "Lady seems distressed." The woman's eyes met his fierce, proud, but Jake caught the flash of hope before she quickly concealed it. She couldn't be more than 25, with the kind of natural beauty that needed no enhancement. More importantly, she had the look of someone who'd never backed down from a fight in her life. "She's not a lady," Brad snarled. "She's just some reservation trash who got lost. We're helping her find her way home." Jake's jaw tightened. "Well, I reckon I can handle that job myself. Why don't you boys head back to town? It's getting dark." Brad's hand moved toward the hunting knife on his belt. "You deaf, Morrison?" I said, "This ain't your concern. Everything that happens on this land is my concern," Jake lied smoothly. "This is Harrison property, and Mr. Harrison don't take kindly to trespassers disturbing his peace." It wasn't true they were actually on public land, but these city boys wouldn't know the difference. Jake watched Brad's companions exchange uncertain glances. They wanted easy prey, not a confrontation with a man who looked like he'd been born in the saddle and raised on hard work. The woman straightened. understanding passing between her and Jake without words. She was ready to fight alongside him. If necessary, Brad cursed, but Jake saw the fear creeping into his eyes. "This ain't over, Morrison. You're making a big mistake." "Wouldn't be my first," Jake replied evenly. "Won't be my last." The three men retreated toward their expensive trucks, muttering threats and curses. Jake waited until their taillights disappeared before turning to the woman. She was examining her overturned ATV with practiced hands, checking for damage. "You hurt?" he asked. She looked up, studying his face in the fading light. "I'm fine, thank you." Her English was perfect, tinged with just a hint of accent that spoke of two worlds bridged by one person. She moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in the wilderness, someone who belonged to this land in ways the Brads of the world never could. "Name's Jake Morrison," he offered. "Ayanna Crowfeather," she replied. "And I can handle my own problems." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in weeks. "I don't doubt that for a second, ma'am. But sometimes having backup ain't such a bad thing." She almost smiled back. Almost. The Rusty Spur Saloon buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd ranch, hands blowing off steam, truckers grabbing a meal, and local businessmen nursing beers and complaints. Jake sat at his usual corner table, nursing a whiskey and trying to ignore the sideways glances he'd been getting all week. Word traveled fast in Cedar Falls, and his encounter with Brad Hutchins had become the town's favorite gossip. "Hey, Morrison," Brad's voice boomed across the saloon, silencing conversations. And turning heads, he swaggered over with his hunting buddies, flanking him like bodyguards. "Heard you got yourself a new girlfriend." Jake didn't look up from his drink. "Brad, boys. Tell me something," Brad continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "What's it like dating someone who lives in a teepee? Does she cook you roadkill for dinner?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Jake's hand tightened around his glass, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd learned long ago that men like Brad fed on reactions. "Heard she's real grateful." "For your help," one of Brad's friends added with a leer. "Indians are supposed to be real friendly to their white saviors, if you know what I mean." This time, the laughter was louder, crueler. Jake felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but something else held him back, the memory of Ayanna's fierce pride, the way she'd stood tall even when cornered. She wouldn't want him starting a fight over her honor. She could handle that. Herself, "You boys sure do talk a lot," Jake said finally, setting his glass down with deliberate calm. "Maybe you should spend less time flapping your gums and more time learning to treat folks with respect." Brad's face darkened. "Respect for what? Some squaw who can't even keep her four-wheeler upright." The word hit the room like a slap. Even the bartender, old Pete Crawford, winced and busied himself cleaning glasses. Jake stood slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Oh, look who's getting all protective," Brad sneered. "What's wrong, Morrison? Can't find a white woman desperate enough too?" Jake moved faster than anyone expected. One moment he was standing by his table, the next his fist connected with Brad's jaw, sending the banker's son sprawling across the floor. The saloon erupted in shouts and scrambling bodies as chairs overturned and drinks scattered. Brad's friends rushed Jake, but years of wrestling steers and breaking horses had given him reflexes most men could only dream of. He ducked the first swing, caught the second man with an uppercut that lifted him off his feet, and had the third pinned against the bar before the dust settled. "Jake Morrison, that's enough." Pete bellowed from behind the bar, a shotgun cradled in his arms. "All of you, settle down or take it outside." Brad struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. His eyes burned with humiliation and rage. "You're gonna regret this, Morrison. My daddy owns half this town, and when I tell him what you did, your daddy's a banker, not a king," Jake interrupted. "And if he raised you right, he'd be ashamed of the way you talk about women." The saloon had gone dead quiet. Brad looked around at the faces watching him, some sympathetic, others clearly disgusted by his behavior. In a small town, reputation mattered more than money, and everyone had heard his words. "This ain't over," Brad hissed, wiping blood from his mouth. "You think you're some kind of hero? Defending that savage? You're nothing but a two-bit cowboy with delusions of grandeur." He turned to address the room, his voice rising. "Look at him. Look at your great defender, getting into fights over some Indian girl he barely knows. What kind of man throws away his reputation for strangers? Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jake felt the weight of their judgment, the subtle shift in loyalty that came with small-town politics. The Hutchins family had influence, money, connections. Jake had calloused hands and an honest reputation, but in Cedar Falls, that might not be enough. "The kind of man this town used to respect," said a voice from the back. Everyone turned to see Walter Crowdog, an elderly Native American man who occasionally came to town for supplies. His weathered face was grave, his dark eyes fixed on Brad, with a kind of steady gaze that had seen too much history repeat itself. Walter Pete said carefully, "Maybe you should." "Should what?" Walter interrupted. "Should pretend I didn't hear that word. Should pretend this young man didn't show more honor in 5 minutes than these boys have shown their whole lives." He walked slowly toward Jake, his boots echoing in the silence. "You know what we call a man who stands up for others when it costs him something? We call him a warrior. Not because he fights, but because he chooses what's right over what's easy." Brad laughed harshly. "Spare us the noble savage speech, old man. This is between me and Morrison." Walter's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air attention that made even the drunk cowboys sober up and pay attention. "My granddaughter told me about 3 men who tried to hurt her last week," Walter said quietly. "She also told me about the cowboy who sent them running. Funny thing she didn't mention his name, but I think I'm looking at him right now." The pieces clicked into place for everyone in the room. Ayanna was Walter's granddaughter, Walter Crowdog, whose family owned more land outside Cedar Falls than anyone except the government. Walter, whose quiet word could make or break contracts, with the local ranchers who grazed cattle on tribal land. Jake felt the shift immediately. Suddenly, Brad's friends were studying their boots, and the other patrons were looking at Jake with new interest. In the complex web of small-town economics, Walter Crowdog carried more weight than a banker's son. She said this cowboy didn't ask for anything in return, Walter continued. Didn't even give his name, just did what needed doing and rode away. That's the old way, the honorable way. He extended his hand to Jake. "Thank you for protecting my family." Jake shook the offered hand, feeling the strength in Walter's weathered fingers. Any decent person would have done the same. "No," Walter said firmly, "they wouldn't. If they would, my granddaughter never would have been in danger in the first place." The truth of that statement hung heavy in the room. How many people had seen harassment, discrimination, or worse, and simply looked the other way? How many times had good people stayed silent because it was easier than getting involved? Brad's face was purple with rage and humiliation. "This is ridiculous. You're all acting like he's some kind of saint because he helped one Indian girl." "Watch your mouth," Jake said quietly. "Or what? You'll hit me again. You think that makes you tough?" Brad's voice cracked with desperation. "You're nothing, Morrison. Nobody. Tomorrow, everyone will remember that you're just a hired hand who throws punches over people who don't even belong here." The laughter that followed was the cruelest sound Jake had ever heard, not because it was loud, but because some of the people joining in were men he'd considered friends, men he'd worked alongside, shared meals with, trusted with his back during dangerous jobs. Walter's expression hardened. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back at the room. "My people have a saying," he said. "A man's character isn't measured by how he treats those who can help him, but by how he treats those who can do nothing for him." His eyes swept the crowd. "Tonight, you've all shown your character." He left, and the saloon erupted in nervous chatter. Jake finished his whiskey in one swallow and dropped money on the table. As he headed for the door, Brad called after him, "Enjoy your moment, Morrison. Tomorrow, when the sun comes up, you'll still be nothing but a fool who threw his life away for strangers." Jake paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Tomorrow, if only Brad knew what tomorrow would bring. Jake woke before dawn, as he had every day for the past 15 years. The bunkhouse was quiet, except for the snores of other ranch hands, men who'd probably avoid eye contact with him after last night's spectacle. He dressed in the dark, grabbed his hat, and stepped into the crisp Montana morning. The eastern sky was just beginning to blush pink when he heard Ita's sound that made him freeze halfway to the barn. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but thunder didn't have rhythm. Thunder didn't have purpose. Horses, hundreds of them. Jake climbed onto the fence rail and looked toward the horizon. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A line of riders stretched across the ridge, silhouetted against the dawn sky, like something from an old Western painting. But as they drew closer, Jake realized this wasn't some romantic vision of the Old West. This was something far more powerful. The riders wore traditional regalia mixed with modern clothing. Eagle feathers caught the morning light, silver buckles gleamed on leather chaps, and the horses beneath them moved with the kind of precision that came from lifelong partnership between human and animal. At the front rode Walter Crow Dog, his weathered face solemn beneath a magnificent war bonnet that spoke of generations of leadership. But it was the young woman riding beside him that made Jake's heart skip. Ayanna sat her paint horse, like she'd been born in the saddle, her long black hair braided with beads and feathers, her dark eyes searching until they found his across the distance. When their gazes met, she nodded. One's a gesture of acknowledgement, respect, and something deeper that Jake couldn't quite name. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Tom Henderson, another ranch hand who'd emerged from the bunkhouse. "Jake, what did you do?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. He was too busy counting riders as they crested the hill and began their descent toward the ranch. 50, 100. More kept coming, a river of horses and riders that seemed to have no end. Young warriors rode alongside tribal elders. Children sat proudly behind their fathers. Women in traditional dresses rode horses, decorated with painted symbols and feathers. 200 warriors, just as Walter had promised, though Jake hadn't understood the promise at the time. By now, every person on the Harrison ranch had emerged. To stare, ranch hands, mechanics, the cook. Even old Mr. Harrison himself stood on his porch in his robe, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. In the distance, Jake could see vehicles pulling over on the main road, early commuters and delivery. Drivers stopping to witness something they'd never seen before and might never see again. The procession moved with ceremony and purpose, but also with unmistakable power. These weren't Hollywood Indians riding for show. These were the descendants of warriors who'd fought the U.S. Army to a standstill, who'd survived genocide in government schools and broken treaties, who'd endured a century of systemic oppression, and somehow kept their culture alive. And this morning, they'd chosen to honor a cowboy who'd simply done what was right. Walter raised his hand, and the entire procession came to a halt. The silence that followed was profound. 200 horses, and riders completely still. Walter dismounted and approached Jake with measured steps, his expression grave. "Jake Morrison," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You showed honor when honor was needed. You showed courage when courage was costly. You stood for what was right when others chose to look away." Jake climbed down from the fence, his legs unsteady. He was aware that every eye was on him, not just the Native Americans, but the growing crowd of white onlookers who'd been drawn by the incredible sight. Cars were pulling into the ranch entrance now, people getting out to witness what was happening. "Just did what anyone should do," Jake said quietly. "But they didn't," Walter replied, "and that's why we're here." He turned to address the crowd that had gathered, ranch workers, townspeople, early morning gawkers who'd been attracted by the sight of 200 horses on the horizon. "This man," Walter said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "protected a member of our family when she was in danger. He asked for nothing in return. He expected no reward. He simply saw wrong and chose to make it right." A murmur ran through the crowd of observers. Jake spotted several familiar faces from last night's incident at the Rusty Spernacluding. Brad Hutchins, who stood beside his father's expensive sedan with his jaw hanging open. "In the old days," Walter continued, "when a man showed such honor, warriors would ride to show their respect. Not to fight, but to acknowledge. To say that true courage doesn't go unnoticed, to remind the world that some things matter more than convenience, more than comfort, more than fitting in." He gestured toward the assembled riders. "These are teachers, ranchers, students, veterans, grandmothers, children. They came because they believe in honor. They came because they recognize a warrior when they see one. Ayanna dismounted and approached, carrying something in her hands, a beaded leather vest. Beautiful in its simplicity, clearly made by skilled hands over many hours. She held it out to Jake. "This belonged to my great-great-grandfather," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "He was a war chief who chose peace when peace was the harder path. My grandmother finished the beadwork just before she passed last year. She always said it was waiting for the right person." Jake's hands trembled as he accepted the vest. The leather was soft as silk, the beadwork intricate beyond description, geometric patterns that seemed to tell stories he couldn't read, but somehow understood. "I can't accept this," he said. "It's too valuable, too important to your family." "Exactly," Ayanna replied. "That's why you're the right person to have it." Walter stepped forward again. "Jake Morrison, you could have minded your own business. You could have ridden past. You could have decided that someone else's trouble wasn't worth your involvement. Instead, you chose to act. You chose to stand. You chose to be the man this world needs more of." He paused, looking around at the crowd of onlookers. "Last night, in your town saloon, this man was mocked for showing courage. He was laughed at for doing what was right. He was called a fool for standing up to men who prey on the vulnerable." Walter's voice hardened. "We wanted those people to see what we think of their judgment." A ripple of uncomfortable shuffling ran through the crowd. Several people were looking at the ground, while others stared defiantly back. Jake could see the division clearly, those who were moved by the ceremony and those who resented it. "This isn't about race," Walter continued. "This isn't about politics or history or old grievances. This is about character. This is about the kind of person you choose to be when you think nobody important is watching." He placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. "Today, we want everyone to know we were watching, and we don't forget." Brad Hutchins pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "This is ridiculous. You're making him out to be some kind of hero because he got involved in something that was none of his business." The crowd fell silent. 200 pairs of dark eyes turned toward Brad with the kind of attention that made strong men reconsider their words. But Brad, whether from courage or stupidity, pressed on. "You want to talk about character? This man started a fight in a public establishment. He assaulted paying customers. He chose troublemaking over keeping the peace." Walter studied Brad for a long moment. "And what did you choose?" The simple question hung in the air like smoke. Brad's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. What could he say? That he'd chosen to terrorize a woman? That he'd chosen to use his privilege as a weapon? That he'd chosen to mock the very concept of honor? "I chose to mind my own business," Brad finally managed. "No," Walter said quietly. "You chose to make a young woman's safety your business when you thought there would be no consequences. You just didn't expect there to be witnesses. You didn't expect anyone to care enough to intervene. You certainly didn't expect anyone to remember." He gestured toward the assembled riders. "We remember everything." The threat wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. The days of acting without consequences, of believing that some people didn't matter, were over. The community was watching now. The community would remember. Brad retreated to his father's car, and Jake watched several other townspeople follow his example, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. But others remained, and Jake could see a different kind of recognition in their eyes, respect, perhaps even shame for their silence the night before. As the morning sun climbed higher, the ceremony began to wind down. Riders remounted their horses, preparing for the journey home. But the impact of what had happened would linger far longer than the hoofprints in the dust. Jake stood holding the vest, still unable to fully process what had just occurred. 200 people had ridden across miles of rough country to honor. A simple act of decency. They'd turned his moment of private conscience into a public declaration that some things, honor, courage, standing up for others, still mattered. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "I didn't do anything special." She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "That's exactly why you did." As the riders departed, Jake watched them disappear over the same ridge they'd appeared from, like a vision fading into legend. But the vest in his hands was real. The memory burned into his mind was real. And the change dynamic in Cedar Falls would prove all too real in the days to come. The people who had laughed were no longer laughing. The people who had mocked were no longer mocking, and Jake Morrison, the quiet cowboy who just wanted to do right by a stranger, found himself at the center of a story that would be told for generations. Asterisk, asterisk, 3 months later. Jake stood in the same spot where he'd first seen the 200 riders crest the hill. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ayanna stood beside him, her hand warm in his, watching their breath mist in the cold December air. The beaded vest Walter had given him was carefully stored in his cabin, too precious for everyday wear. But its meaning had become part of who he was. Regretted yet? She asked, a teasing note in her voice. Jake squeezed her hand. Which part? Standing up to those idiots, getting punched by your cousin Bobby when he thought I wasn't serious about you, or agreeing to help teach riding lessons to 60 reservation kids? All of it, she laughed. Your life was so peaceful before. Peaceful? Jake considered the word. His life had been quiet, solitary, predictable, but peaceful. He wasn't sure he'd ever truly known peace until he'd learned what it felt like to live without compromising his principles. The changes in Cedar Falls had been gradual, but undeniable. The Hutchins family still held their position at the bank, but their social influence had evaporated like morning dew. Brad had left town entirely after a few more public confrontations made his presence untenable. Some of the old-timers still grumbled about outside interference and political correctness, but they grumbled quietly now. More importantly, new alliances had formed. The Harrison Ranch had signed its first contract to graze cattle on tribal land, a mutually beneficial arrangement that Walter had suggested and Jake had helped negotiate. Other ranchers followed suit, creating economic partnerships that strengthened both communities. Pete Crawford had banned racial slurs from the Rusty Spur, posting a simple sign that read, "Respect all patrons or find another bar." The policy had cost him some customers, but gained him others tribal members who now felt welcome. Decent folks who appreciated the improved atmosphere, and visitors drawn by the saloon's growing reputation as a place where the Old West's better values were still honored. Jake himself had become something of a local legend, though not always in ways he enjoyed. Tourists occasionally sought him out, wanting to hear the story firsthand or take pictures with the cowboy who stood up to prejudice. He'd learned to avoid the main streets when tour buses were in town, but the most significant change was standing beside him now. Ayanna had entered his life like sunrise after a long night, gradual at first, then sudden and transformative. She was a teacher at the reservation school, a skilled horsewoman, and a bridge between two worlds that had been kept artificially separate for too long. Your grandfather coming to dinner Sunday? Jake asked. Wouldn't miss it. He's bringing that photo album again, the one with all the pictures of warriors in your vest. Jake grinned. Walter's history lessons had become a weekly tradition, along with Sunday dinners that somehow always ended up feeding half the valley. The small cabin Jake rented had become an unofficial meeting place where ranchers and tribal members discussed everything from weather, patterns, to water rights, to the best techniques for breaking mustangs. Speaking of which, Ayanna continued, he wanted me to ask if you'd consider something. What now? Last time he wanted me to consider something. I ended up agreeing to judge a rodeo competition between reservation kids and town kids. Took me 3 hours to get all the mud out of my hair. This is different, more serious. Ayanna turned to face him fully. The tribal council is creating a new position liaison between the reservation and surrounding communities. Someone to help negotiate contracts, resolve disputes, build relationships. They want someone both sides trust. Jake felt his stomach drop. Ayanna, I'm not qualified for something like that. I'm a ranch hand, not a diplomat. You're exactly what they need. You understand both worlds. You've proven your character, and people listen to you whether you realize it or not. She paused. The town council has agreed to co-fund the position. Mayor Williams personally requested that they offer it to you. The implications hit him like a physical blow. A real job, with real responsibilities, serving both communities he'd come to love. The chance to build something lasting instead of just maintaining other people's property. A future that could support a family. What would you say if I told you I was scared? He asked quietly. I'd say fear is what you feel when something really matters to you, she replied, and I'd say you've never backed down from anything that mattered before. A sound in the distance made them both turn. Another group of riders was approaching, not the massive procession of 3 months ago, but a smaller party. Jake recognized several faces, young people from both the reservation and town, riding together on a weekend trail expedition that had become surprisingly popular. Leading them was Bobby Crowfeather, Ayanna's cousin, who'd initially been deeply suspicious of any white man dating his relative. It had taken 2 black eyes, 1 broken nose, Bobby's, and several long conversations before they'd reached an understanding. Now Bobby was one of Jake's closest friends and his most enthusiastic supporter for the liaison position. "Jake, Bobby called as the group approached. "Perfect timing. We wanted to show you something." The riders spread out, revealing what they'd been protecting in their Santara young white girl, maybe 16, riding confidently beside a crowboy about the same age. Jake recognized her as Jenny Phillips, daughter of one of the more vocal opponents of mixing the communities. Jenny, Ayanna called, "What are you doing here?" The girl blushed, but lifted her chin defiantly. "Learning to ride properly. Tom's been teaching me." She gestured to the young man beside her. "Turns out everything my dad told me about Indians was wrong." "Who knew?" Tom grinned. "Turns out everything my friends told me about white girls was wrong too. Some of them are actually pretty cool." Bobby laughed. "They're both terrible riders, but they're getting better. More importantly, they're getting along." Jake watched the easy interaction between kids who 3 months ago would never have spoken to each other. This was the real victory, not dramatic gesture of 200 warriors, but the quiet daily choice to see past old prejudices and build something new. "There's something else," Bobby continued, his expression growing serious. "Tom's dad wants to talk to you, Jake. There's been some trouble with cattle rustlers hitting both reservation and private herds. They think someone's organizing it, targeting the partnerships between ranchers and tribal operations, trying to destroy what we've built." Jake said grimly. "Exactly, but they didn't count on something." Bobby's grin returned. They didn't count on having to face unified communities, ranchers and tribal police working together, cowboys and warriors watching each other's backs. Jake felt Ayanna squeeze his hand and realized she was thinking the same thing he was. The liaison position wasn't just about negotiating contracts or resolving disputes. It was about protecting something precious and new, the kind of community where a cowboy's character mattered more than his bank account, where young people could form friendships across old boundaries, where standing up for what's right earned respect instead of mockery. "I'll take the job," he said quietly. Ayanna's smile could have powered the entire valley. "I was hoping you'd say that, but I have conditions," Jake continued. "I want Bobby as my deputy. I want Jenny and Tom to help organize youth programs, and I want Pete Crawford to cater the office opening party." Bobby whooped with delight. "Partner, you just made the best decision of your life." As the sun set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 3 months ago, he'd been a solitary cowboy with simple ambitions. Tonight, he was part of something larger community that had chosen unity over division, understanding over prejudice, courage over convenience. The laughter that had once stung him seemed like ancient history now. The people who had mocked him for throwing away his reputation for strangers had learned something important. Strangers were just friends you hadn't met yet, and reputation built on the wrong foundations wasn't worth protecting anyway. Jake Morrison had saved 1 woman from 3 bullies on a lonely evening in October. In return, he'd gained a community, a purpose, a love story, and the satisfaction that comes from discovering who you really are, when it costs you something to be decent. As Ayanna leaned against his shoulder and the young riders prepared to head home, Jake realized that sometimes the best rewards for doing right aren't the dramatic gestures, they're the quiet moments afterward. When you realize you're exactly where you belong, with exactly the right people, building exactly the kind of worlds worth fighting for. The cowboys and warriors of Montana had found common ground, and it all started with one man who couldn't stand to ride past someone else's trouble. In the distance, a coyote howled, not a sound of loneliness, but a song of wild freedom, carrying across a landscape where anything was possible if you had the courage to make it so. The E&D, if you enjoyed this story of courage, community, and the power of doing what's right, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with friends who believe in standing up for others, and subscribe for more inspiring tales that remind us of the best of human nature. What would you have done in Jake's situation? Let us know in the comments below.